Welcome back again. It's been a while. I have another true crime compilation to help you fall asleep. Please let me know down in the comments what you think about my true crime episodes. I would love to get some feedback. Let's get straight into it. On the evening of October 21st, 1978, a 20-year-old pilot named Frederick Valentich took off from Moorabbin Airport outside Melbourne, Australia. He was flying a single-engine Cessna over Bass Strait. A routine trip, he'd said. He never landed. What investigators recovered wasn't wreckage, or a body, or even an oil slick. It was a radio transcript. 7 minutes of a young man describing something above him that he could not identify, ending in 17 seconds of metallic scraping sound, and then silence. No trace of Frederick Valentich or his aircraft has ever been found. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand who Frederick Valentich was, because he was not a seasoned pilot making a careless mistake. He was a young man who genuinely loved flying and had been chasing a career in aviation for years. Frederick grew up in Melbourne. By the time he was 20, he had applied to the Royal Australian Air Force twice. Both times he was rejected. The reasons were never fully made public, but the rejections did not stop him. He kept flying through civilian channels and eventually logged around 150 hours of total flight time, earning a Class 4 instrument rating. But there was a detail that investigators kept coming back to. A Class 4 instrument rating did not qualify him for night flying. And the route he filed on October 21st, 1978, from Moorabbin Airport south across Bass Strait to King Island would take him over open water in the dark. He filed the flight plan anyway. The official reason for the trip was simple. He told people he was flying to King Island to pick up crayfish for friends. It sounded casual, almost offhand. But when investigators later checked with staff at King Island Airport, there was no record of anyone expecting him. There was no crayfish order, no scheduled arrival. That detail would not come to light until after he was already gone. The weather that evening was clear. Visibility was good. Bass Strait, which sits between mainland Australia and Tasmania, has a reputation for rough conditions, but not that night. There was no mechanical reason and no environmental reason for anything to go wrong. Investigators would note this repeatedly in the months that followed. At 6:19 in the evening, Frederick climbed into his Cessna 182L, registration Victor Hotel, Delta Sierra Juliet, and departed Moorabbin Airport alone. There were no passengers. Just him, a single-engine plane, and roughly 235 kilometers of open water ahead. The flight north toward Cape Otway was uneventful. He contacted Melbourne Flight Service units at the appropriate checkpoints. His voice on the radio was steady. Nothing in the early transmissions suggested any distress. He was tracking normally, flying at an altitude of around 4,500 feet, and the night was clear enough that he could see the lights of the coastline below him. What nobody knew at the time, not Frederick and not the controllers on the ground, was that he had about 47 minutes left before his final transmission. The psychology of the moment is important. Frederick Valentich was not a reckless person by most accounts. People who knew him described someone serious about aviation, maybe a little obsessive about it. He read about UFOs and believed in the possibility of unexplained aerial phenomena. Whether that matters to what happened next is one of the questions that has never been settled. At 7:06 in the evening, he opened the radio channel and asked Melbourne Flight Service a question that would start one of the strangest 7 minutes in aviation history. He wanted to know if there was any known air traffic in his area. There was not. The question itself was routine. Pilots check for nearby traffic all the time. Melbourne Flight Service confirmed what their radar showed. Nothing. No known aircraft in Frederick's area. He acknowledged the response and went quiet for a moment. Then, less than a minute later, he came back on the frequency. He reported a large aircraft below him, passing at high speed. 4 bright lights. He asked if there were any military aircraft operating in the area. Melbourne told him no. No military traffic, no civilian traffic, nothing that should have been anywhere near him. Frederick went quiet again. 30 seconds passed. Then he was back on the radio, and this time his tone had shifted. Not panicked, but unsettled. He said the aircraft had returned. It was flying over him now at high speed. It was not responding to him. It was not behaving like any aircraft he recognized. Ken Williams, the air traffic controller handling the transmission that night, later said that Valentich sounded calm, controlled. He was not screaming. He was not slurring his words. He was describing what he saw the same way a pilot is trained to, methodically, with as much detail as he could give. Williams said it did not sound like confusion. It sounded like a report. Over the next several minutes, the transmissions continued. The object, whatever it was, circled him. It approached from the east. It moved at speeds he could not account for. At one point, it appeared to hover directly above him, close enough that he described it as stationary over the top of his aircraft. He said, and this is a direct quote from the transcript, "It seems to me that he is playing some sort of game." That line is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something about his state of mind. He was not theorizing about what the craft was. He was not naming it. He was describing its behavior, and what struck him was that the behavior seemed deliberate. Whatever was up there, in his words, appeared to be reacting to him. Then the engine started running rough. He reported it as a possible rough idle. He asked for clearance to descend to King Island immediately. Melbourne gave him clearance. His voice stayed level, but the situation was clearly deteriorating. He had an unidentified object above him, an engine that was not responding properly, and open water below him in the dark. At 7:12 in the evening, Melbourne asked him to confirm his intentions. He responded with 4 words. "My intentions are..." A pause, and then, "It is not an aircraft." Those were the last intelligible words Frederick Valentich ever spoke. What followed was 17 seconds of sound. Investigators, aviation analysts, and audio experts have all listened to it. The general description is consistent. A metallic scraping or grinding noise, rhythmic at points, unlike anything produced by a standard Cessna in mechanical distress. It does not match the sound of a stall. It does not match engine failure. It has never been matched to anything at all. Then the frequency went dead. Melbourne Flight Service tried to raise him repeatedly. Nothing. The total duration of the encounter, from his first question about traffic to the silence, was just under 7 minutes. 7 minutes. That is all there is. No follow-up transmission, no distress call, no mayday. Just a young pilot describing something he could not explain, right up until the moment he stopped describing anything at all. The transcript was recorded. It was preserved. It exists today, word for word, and you can read it yourself. And what makes it so unsettling is not any single thing he said. It is the combination. The calm delivery, the real-time observations, the strange behavior of the object, the engine trouble. And then, that sound. In missing person cases, silence is usually gradual. Here, it was immediate. Within hours of the frequency going dead, a search and rescue operation was underway. The Australian Maritime Safety Authority coordinated the response. Aircraft and vessels moved into Bass Strait almost immediately, covering the route Frederick had been flying, from Cape Otway south toward King Island. The search area eventually stretched across more than 1,000 square miles of open water. It ran for several days, pulling in resources from the Royal Australian Air Force, civilian aviation authorities, and maritime services. They found nothing. No wreckage, no fuel slick on the water, no debris field, no personal effects. No trace of the Cessna 182L, registration Victor Hotel, Delta Sierra Juliet, or of the man flying it. This is the detail that separates the Frederick Valentich case from most aviation disappearances. When aircraft go down over water, even deep water, they almost always leave something behind. Seat cushions, instrument panels, pieces of fuselage. The ocean is destructive, but it is rarely complete. Investigators who worked in Bass Strait knew this. The strait is relatively shallow in sections. Recovery of at least some material was considered likely. And yet, after days of systematic searching across more than 1,000 square miles, there was nothing. The Royal Australian Air Force conducted its own investigation alongside the Australian Department of Transport. Both ran parallel inquiries, reviewing the radio transcript, the weather records, the flight plan, and the radar data from that evening. Neither investigation produced a definitive answer. The official finding, when it eventually came, read that the reason for the disappearance of the aircraft had not been determined. That was not a conclusion. It was an acknowledgement that no conclusion was possible. Bass Strait has a long history of swallowing ships and aircraft. Conditions can deteriorate quickly. But the night of October 21st, 1978, was not one of those nights. Multiple sources confirmed clear skies, calm conditions, and good visibility across the strait. Whatever happened to Frederick Valentich did not happen because the weather caught him off guard. Then, a few weeks after the disappearance, something small surfaced. A witness near Cape Otway, the last known point along Frederick's route before open water, reported seeing a green light in the sky on the evening of October 21st. The witness described it descending rapidly toward the water at around the time that matched Frederick's final transmission. It was a single account, unverified. Green lights over water at night have any number of explanations. But investigators logged it because in the absence of physical evidence, even a single witness report carries weight. It was the only piece of information, however loose, that placed anything unusual in that part of the sky that evening. The search was eventually stood down. No timeline was given publicly for when recovery efforts officially ended, but the operational search wound down within days of it beginning. There was simply nothing to find a trail toward. No debris pattern, no last known position confirmed by wreckage. Just the transcript, the coordinates he had been flying through, and the open water of Bass Strait. What investigators were left with was a radio record of something happening. They just could not determine what. And because there was no physical evidence to anchor any theory, every explanation that followed remained exactly that, a theory. The case was filed. The file stayed open. And the questions that the transcript raised, what was the object, what caused the engine to run rough, what made that sound, stayed open with it. With no wreckage and no body, the investigation had nowhere physical to go. What it had was a transcript, a timeline, and a set of facts that did not fully fit any single explanation. So investigators, aviation analysts, and researchers spent the years that followed trying to make the pieces work. None of them fully succeeded. The first theory, and the one most aviation authorities leaned toward, was spatial disorientation. It works like this. A pilot flying at night over open water loses visual reference. There is no horizon. There is no ground lighting. The vestibular system, the part of the body that senses orientation, starts feeding incorrect information to the brain. A pilot can be in a slow descending spiral and feel completely level. This is sometimes called graveyard spiral because pilots have died from it without ever knowing they were in one. Under this theory, Frederick Valentich became disoriented after dark, entered an inverted or spiraling flight path, and what he described as an external object was actually his own aircraft's navigation lights, reflected in the water below, or some other visual distortion produced by the conditions. The engine roughness could have been the result of the unusual flight attitude. The final sound, the metallic scraping, could have been the airframe entering distress before impact. It is a coherent explanation. Spatial disorientation claims experienced pilots. It would not be unusual for a 20-year-old with 150 hours of flight time to fall victim to it. But there is a problem. It does not explain the absence of wreckage. A Cessna 182 impacting Bass Strait at any speed would leave debris. The water is not that deep. The search was thorough. Spatial disorientation explains the psychology of the transmission. It does not explain what happened to the aircraft afterward. The second theory involves something more deliberate. Some investigators and commentators raised the possibility that Frederick staged his own disappearance. The crayfish story had already unraveled. King Island had no record of him. There was no verifiable reason for the flight. Under this reading, he fabricated the radio encounter to create a cover story, then flew somewhere else entirely, landed without filing a report, and disappeared by choice. It sounds implausible, but investigators noted that a determined person with a working aircraft and a prepared plan could potentially land on a remote airstrip, abandon the plane, and vanish. It has been done before in other cases. What makes it difficult to accept is the transcript itself. Ken Williams, the controller who took the transmission live, said he believed Frederick was genuine. The real-time quality of the encounter, the pauses, the corrections, the escalating concern, is difficult to fake in the moment across a recorded radio channel without rehearsal. And the metallic sound at the end was not something Frederick produced with his voice. Whatever made that sound was mechanical. The third theory is the one that has followed this case around the world for more than 4 decades. That Frederick encountered something genuinely unidentified. Something that was not a conventional aircraft, behaved in ways no conventional aircraft can, and was responsible in some way for his disappearance. The Australian UFO Research Network filed formal submissions to the investigation run by the Australian Department of Transport. Researchers point to the specific language in the transcript, the hovering, the high-speed passes, the object appearing to react to Frederick's movements, as consistent with patterns reported in other sightings from the same era. The case is cited globally as one of the most credible on record, precisely because the witness was trained, the transmission was recorded in real time, and the witness had no opportunity to embellish or revise what he said. Richard Hocking, the Department of Transport investigator assigned to the case, stated publicly that the case was unexplained and that he could not rule out any hypothesis. That is not a dismissal. That is an official acknowledgement that the evidence did not point cleanly in any direction. What stands out in retrospect is that all 3 theories carry weight, and all 3 carry gaps. The spatial disorientation argument lacks wreckage. The staged disappearance argument lacks motive and a destination. The unexplained encounter argument lacks physical confirmation. More than 45 years later, none of them have closed. Frederick Valentich's father, Guido Valentich, never accepted that the case was closed. He spent years pushing for renewed investigation, writing to authorities, speaking to researchers, and maintaining publicly that his son had encountered something real and unexplained that night. He did not frame it as grief. He framed it as a matter of evidence. His son had been on a recorded radio channel describing something in real time, and no one had ever explained what that something was. Guido believed the transcript deserved a serious answer. He never received one. The case file remained open with the Australian Transport Safety Bureau. It remains open today. In 1983, 5 years after the disappearance, a man named Roy Manifold came forward with something unexpected. He said he had been near Cape Otway on the evening of October 21st, 1978, and had taken a series of photographs shortly before Frederick's final transmission. When the photos were developed and later analysed, they appeared to show an unidentified object over the water. Investigators and photo analysts examined them. No definitive explanation was produced. The images were neither confirmed as genuine evidence nor dismissed as fabrication. They were, like everything else in this case, inconclusive. Aviation safety researchers continued to study the case, primarily through the lens of spatial disorientation. The Valentich disappearance is often cited in training contexts as an example of how quickly a pilot's situational awareness can deteriorate over open water at night. The argument is a reasonable one, but every time it surfaces in that context, the same problem follows it. Spatial disorientation explains the transmission. It does not explain why no wreckage was ever recovered from a well-searched, relatively shallow body of water. That gap has never been filled. What this case leaves behind is not a mystery in the dramatic sense. It is something quieter and harder, an official record that simply stops. A young man, 20 years old, with 150 hours of flight time and plans to eventually fly commercially, flying over Bass Strait on a clear night, describing something above him that he could not name. And then 17 seconds of sound that no one has ever identified. And then nothing. The transcript is the only artifact the case produced. There is no wreckage to examine, no forensic evidence to reanalyze, no new witness to find. Just 7 minutes of audio that has been studied from every angle for more than 4 decades and still does not yield a clear answer. Whatever Frederick Valentich encountered that night, whether it was a trick of the dark, something of his own making, or something else entirely, it left no trace. He left no trace. That absence is the most unsettling detail of all, because it does not close the case. It simply holds it open indefinitely without resolution. The psychology of the moment is important, and more than 45 years later, we still do not fully understand it. Let's get to the second story. He's sitting in a federal interrogation room in Anchorage, Alaska. Calm, relaxed, almost like he's waiting for a bus. Investigators expected fear, maybe anger. What they got was something else. A man who wanted to talk, but only on his terms. He asked for a map. Not a lawyer, a map. And then, point by point, he began describing a murder he'd committed in a state no one had ever connected him to. That was the moment investigators realized they weren't dealing with someone they understood. They were dealing with someone who had been planning this, all of it, for years. Israel Keyes was born on January 7th, 1978, in Richmond, Utah. He was raised in a large Mormon family with 11 children in total, and the household moved constantly across the American West. Oregon, Washington, Arizona. There were no fixed roots and no permanent community. His father was a strict man, and the family's religious life was rigid. For Israel, childhood was not about friendships or school dances or Little League. It was about discipline, isolation, and learning to exist without anyone really knowing him. That isolation was not forced on him for long. He adapted to it. By his own account, he was already doing things at 14 that he knew he could not tell anyone about. He broke into houses. He developed an early obsession with traps and mechanics, rigging systems in the woods that moved targets on pulleys and testing homemade silencers on revolvers. He told investigators years later that around age 14 he understood he was different, not troubled in the way people get help for, different in a way he intended to protect. His family had connections to Chevy Kehoe, a white supremacist and convicted murderer. Keyes spent time around those circles in his teens. The exposure to extreme, organized, ideological violence was not incidental. It shaped how he thought about power, planning, and secrecy. In 1998, Keyes joined the United States Army. He served for 3 years. By most accounts, he was unremarkable, disciplined, kept to himself, and did not cause problems. He was stationed at Fort Lewis in Washington. There are accounts suggesting he committed crimes during this period, taking advantage of leave rotations to operate in ways that were difficult to trace back to active duty personnel. He was honorably discharged in 2001. After the army, he drifted through the Pacific Northwest before eventually settling in Anchorage, Alaska in 2007. He chose Anchorage specifically, and the choice made sense if you understood how he thought. Alaska is vast and remote. People there move differently. Distances between towns stretch for hundreds of miles. Neighbors do not watch each other closely, and a man who comes and goes without explanation does not raise questions. Alaska gave him the space he needed. He started a construction business. It was legitimate and functional, and it gave him something critical: a reason to travel, a reason to be gone for days at a time without anyone asking why. He had a daughter whom he loved, by most accounts genuinely. He paid his taxes. He showed up to jobs on time. His clients described him as reliable. Neighbors called him quiet. His girlfriend, by all indications, had no idea who she was living with. That surface, the contractor, the father, the neighbor who shoveled your driveway, was not accidental. Keyes understood that the best camouflage is not a disguise. It is a reputation, and he spent years building one. But underneath that ordinary life, something else was being built. Quietly, carefully, over years. He was not impulsive. That is the first thing you have to understand about Israel Keyes. Most violent offenders, even the ones who plan ahead, are reactive at some level. They respond to opportunity. They escalate under pressure. They leave traces because they are driven by emotion. Keyes was not. He treated violence the way a contractor treats a project, with logistics, timelines, and preparation that began long before any work started. By the time he was operating in Alaska with a legitimate business and a family, he had already been building something else entirely. Not just plans, not just intentions. Physical infrastructure, buried in the ground, scattered across the country. Waiting. He had one rule above almost all others. He told investigators this plainly, without embarrassment. He never targeted anyone near where he lived. The separation between his home and his crimes was deliberate and total. For years it held. Nobody in Alaska looked at Israel Keyes and saw anything worth looking at. That was exactly the point. Here is where it becomes specific. And the specifics are what make Israel Keyes different from nearly every other violent offender in modern American criminal history. Keyes did not just plan murders in advance. He pre-positioned the tools for them, sometimes years before he ever chose a victim. He would travel to a remote location, dig a hole, and bury a sealed container in the ground. Inside that container were cash, weapons, restraints, and other supplies he would need when he came back. He called them murder kits. And then he would leave. Drive away, fly home, go back to work, back to his daughter, back to his construction schedule. The kit sat in the ground waiting, sometimes for 2 years or more, while Keyes went on living his ordinary life in Alaska. Think about what that requires, not just the logistics, though those are significant. It requires a level of patience and emotional detachment that is difficult to frame in normal human terms. He was not acting on impulse. He was not driven by rage or desperation in the moment. He was operating on a timeline that stretched across years, burying the tools of a crime long before he had even decided who the crime would involve. The Federal Bureau of Investigation later confirmed the existence of multiple caches. The exact number of kits and the exact locations of all of them has never been fully established. Some were recovered. Some were moved by Keyes himself between trips. At least one kit was buried in Vermont, near Essex, in 2009. He did not use it until 2011. 2 years that container sat in the ground, while the Bill Courier and Lorraine Courier went about their lives a few miles away, with no connection to the man who had already buried the means of their deaths in the surrounding countryside. He paid for everything in cash. That is not a small detail. On a murder trip, Keyes went entirely dark financially. No credit cards, no debit transactions. He kept his cell phone turned off. Not on silent, not in airplane mode. Completely off. He understood clearly and specifically how digital trails worked and how investigators reconstructed timelines from them. So he removed himself from those systems entirely when it mattered. The geographic logic of his trips was equally deliberate. He would fly into one city, then rent a car and drive hundreds of miles in a completely different direction. The flight origin had no relationship to the destination. The rental car pickup location had no relationship to where he was going. To anyone cross-referencing records, there was nothing connecting point A to point B to point C. The separation was the whole point. He treated the travel like a construction job in a different state. Show up, do the work, go home. Except the work was being done with tools he had buried in someone else's backyard 2 years earlier. Investigators who later analyzed his travel patterns described them as deliberately irrational, meaning that from the outside they made no geographic sense. That was a feature, not a flaw. Traditional law enforcement methods for tracking violent offenders rely on geographic clustering. Where did the crimes happen, and where does that point to as an origin? Keyes had studied that logic and built a system specifically designed to defeat it. He was not anchored to a region. He was not anchored to a victim type. He was not anchored to anything a profiler could use. The murder kits were the physical expression of that system. They meant there was no preparation phase visible near the crime scene. No one saw him buying rope in a local hardware store the week before. No one remembered a stranger asking questions around town. By the time he arrived to use a kit, everything was already in place. He was simply the final moving piece. What nobody knew at the time, what the Federal Bureau of Investigation would not understand until they were sitting across from him in that Anchorage interrogation room, was that some of those kits were never used. Some are still out there, buried somewhere in the American landscape. Exactly where, nobody knows. And the kits were not just buried and forgotten. He went back for them. Between 2001 and 2012, Israel Keyes made at least 11 trips across the continental United States, possibly more. The Federal Bureau of Investigation pieced together what it could from flight records, rental car logs, and the fragments of information Keyes chose to share during his interrogations. What emerged was a travel pattern so deliberately fragmented that investigators described it as something they had never seen before in a domestic violent offender case. He flew out of Anchorage regularly. That part was not unusual. People in Alaska fly out of state constantly because driving anywhere significant from Anchorage is either impossible or impractical. But where Keyes went, and what he did when he got there, followed a logic that had nothing to do with his construction business and everything to do with the system he had built. He targeted the lower 48. He moved through the Pacific Northwest, New England, the Midwest United States, and the Southern United States, not in clusters. Not in a pattern that pointed back toward a home base. The geographic analysts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who use spatial data to identify where an offender likely lives based on where they operate, could not anchor him. He had broken the fundamental assumption that underlies geographic profiling, that people commit crimes close to where they feel comfortable. Keyes felt comfortable everywhere because he had deliberately made himself feel comfortable nowhere in particular. He never targeted the same area twice. That is confirmed. It was a rule he kept with the same discipline he applied to everything else. Once a location was used, it was finished. He moved on. No returns, no revisits, no nostalgia for a particular geography. Each trip was its own contained operation. He flew into major airports such as O'Hare International Airport, and Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. Places where thousands of people move through every single day, and one more face with a carry-on bag registers as nothing. Then he would pick up a rental car and drive, sometimes hundreds of miles. The distance between where he landed and where he was going was part of the insulation. A crime in rural Vermont does not connect easily to a flight into Chicago without a reason to look. And there was never a reason to look, because there was no victim, no missing person report, and no open case pointing in his direction. He timed his trips around his construction schedule. Absences were normal. A contractor traveling for work does not raise questions. His girlfriend knew he traveled. His clients knew he traveled. The cover was embedded in the life he had built, and the life he had built was designed, at least in part, to provide that cover. On every trip, his phone stayed off, his cards stayed home. He moved through the country like a ghost, present in physical space, but invisible in every digital record. The only financial transactions that could place him anywhere were the cash withdrawals he made before leaving Alaska. After that, he vanished from the paper trail entirely until he landed back home. The psychology of the moment is important here. This was not someone acting under pressure, making decisions on the fly and hoping not to get caught. Keyes had thought through every layer of how investigations work and had built his operating method to defeat each one. Geographic profiling was defeated. Financial tracking was defeated. Victim connection was defeated. Cell phone location data was defeated. He was not running from the system. He was moving parallel to it in a lane the system did not have instruments to detect. Federal Bureau of Investigation analysts later said, with no uncertainty, that if Samantha Koenig's debit card had never moved, Israel Keyes would almost certainly never have been identified. Not because the system failed, but because he had studied the system and built himself around it. That pattern held for years. 11 trips, multiple states, crimes that have never been fully catalogued. Until Vermont. Bill Currier and Lorraine Currier had been married for years. They lived in Essex, Vermont, a quiet town outside Burlington, the kind of place where people know their neighbors and leave their doors unlocked out of habit. Bill worked in IT. Lorraine worked at a psychiatric facility. They were ordinary people in the most complete sense of that word. No enemies, no dangerous habits, no reason for anyone to want to hurt them. On the night of June 8th, 2011, they did not come home. There were no signs of forced entry at the house. That detail matters. Keyes had been there before anyone noticed anything was wrong. He had cut the phone line and disabled the alarm system before ever stepping inside. The Curriers did not hear a knock and open the door to a stranger. They were in their home, and then suddenly they were not in control of what happened inside it. Keyes described the approach as a blitz, fast, overwhelming, designed to eliminate any possibility of resistance before it could form. He had the tools he needed. He had buried them 2 years earlier. That kit, the one he had placed in the ground near Essex in 2009, contained a handgun, restraints, and other supplies. He dug it up the night of the attack. By the time he entered the Currier home, he was not improvising. He was executing. He bound them both. Then he loaded them into their own vehicle and drove to an abandoned farmhouse nearby. What happened in that farmhouse over the following hours involved the deaths of both Bill and Lorraine Currier. Bill was shot in the basement with a .22 caliber Ruger Charger fitted with a homemade silencer. Lorraine was strangled. Their bodies were never recovered. Keyes had planned to return later and burn the farmhouse down. He never did. His bank-robbing plans pulled him in a different direction after the murders, and the building sat untouched. Investigators would later search it, but without Keyes pointing them to the exact location of the remains, the Curriers stayed missing. Now, here is what stands out in retrospect. Keyes had no connection to Essex, Vermont. He had never been there before. He did not know the couriers. He did not follow them, did not select them from a distance over weeks or months. He chose Vermont almost at random, picked it off a map as a location far enough from his life in Alaska to be untraceable. The couriers were simply the people whose home matched his criteria. Isolated enough, accessible enough, far enough from anyone who knew his name. He had flown into Chicago O'Hare International Airport under his real name, rented a car there, and driven roughly 1,000 miles east to Vermont. Chicago to Vermont. Those two locations have no obvious relationship to each other, and that was precisely the logic. Nothing about the crime scene pointed to Chicago. Nothing about Chicago pointed to Alaska. The layers of distance between Israel Keyes, the contractor, and the abandoned farmhouse in Essex was so deep that without his eventual confession, investigators might never have connected the two. The courier case went cold. Essex police had a missing persons case, then a presumed homicide with no bodies, no suspect, and no leads that went anywhere. For nearly a year, Bill and Lorraine Currier were simply gone. Two people who vanished from a house in Vermont with their alarm disabled and their phone line cut, and nothing left behind that pointed anywhere useful. After the murders, Keyes moved the remaining items from the kit to a new location in Parishville, New York, where they stayed buried until after his arrest. He relocated his tools the same way a contractor moves equipment between job sites. Methodical, unhurried. Already thinking about the next trip, the Currier case would have stayed cold forever. Their names would have remained on a list of unresolved homicides in a small New England state. Bill and Lorraine Currier would never have been connected to a construction contractor in Anchorage, Alaska. Not in any timeline where Israel Keyes kept doing exactly what he had been doing. Except Keyes made one mistake, and it was not in Vermont. February 1st, 2012, Anchorage, Alaska. A small drive-through coffee kiosk called Common Grounds Espresso sat on East Tudor Road, tucked behind snow berms that had piled up over a particularly heavy winter. The berms were tall enough that passing cars on the road could not easily see the stand. It closed later than most of the other kiosks in the area. On that night, 18-year-old Samantha Koenig was working the closing shift alone. Keyes had never been to Common Grounds before that night. He told investigators that himself, almost as a point of clarification. He had not surveilled the location for weeks, had not followed Samantha, had not built a file on her routine. He drove past, assessed the situation, and made a decision. The snow berms. The late hour. The single employee. That was enough. He parked, approached on foot, and what happened next was fast and controlled. A blitz. The same word he had used to describe Vermont. He was armed. Samantha had no way out of the kiosk, and no way to reach anyone before he had her. This was the one case where Keyes broke his own most important rule. He operated close to home, in Alaska, in his own city. He had maintained that separation for years. 11 trips, multiple states, crimes that pointed nowhere near Anchorage. And then, in February 2012, he walked up to a coffee stand 4 miles from his house and abducted a teenager. He brought Samantha to a shed on his property, bound her, and turned a radio up loud enough to cover any sound. Then he went back inside his house, packed his bags, and went to bed. In the morning, he woke his daughter, got her ready for school, and drove to the airport. He and his girlfriend had a cruise vacation booked out of New Orleans. He boarded the ship and left. Samantha Koenig was already dead by the time he returned. He had killed her before leaving, strangled her in the shed, and left her body there while he spent more than 2 weeks on a cruise through warm water, eating dinner and watching the ocean. When he came back to Anchorage, he was not done with her. What he did next is one of the most disturbing details of the entire case. He staged her body, posed it to look like she was still alive, held a recent copy of an Anchorage newspaper near the frame, and took a Polaroid photograph. He used that image to construct a ransom demand. He sent it to her family, told them she was alive, told them she could come home if they paid. Her father, James Koenig, deposited money into her account. Keyes had Samantha's debit card, and he began using it. He withdrew cash across multiple states as he traveled, moving south and east through the American Southwest, pulling money from ATMs in a trail that stretched from Alaska down through New Mexico and into Texas. Each transaction moved the thread further. Each withdrawal was another point on a map that investigators could, for the first time, actually follow. Here is what was different about this case compared to everything that came before it. The couriers left no trail. The victims in Washington, in the Midwest, in New England, whoever they were, left no trail. Keyes had always been the only moving piece, and he had kept himself invisible. But Samantha Koenig's debit card moved through the country's financial system and left a record that did not belong to a ghost. It belonged to a specific card, tied to a specific name, used at specific machines, at specific times. He had always operated in the dark, in cash, in silence. And then he used a dead girl's bank card across 6 states. That is what broke it. Not sophisticated forensic work, not a geographic profile, not a tip from someone who knew him. A debit card, moving, leaving a record. For the first time, Israel Keyes had left something behind that moved. The Anchorage Police Department knew Samantha Koenig was missing within days. Her boyfriend had reported her gone. Security footage from the coffee stand showed the abduction, a figure approaching on foot, armed, moving fast. The footage was clear enough to see the shape of what happened, but not clear enough to give investigators a name. They had a victim. They had a crime. They had no suspect. What they also had, quietly, was a debit card that had not stopped moving. James Koenig had done what the ransom note asked. He deposited money into Samantha's account, hoping his daughter was still alive, hoping the photograph with the newspaper meant something real. Investigators let the transactions continue once they identified the card was active. Every ATM hit was a data point. Every withdrawal was a timestamp and a location. The trail started in Alaska and moved south, down through the American Southwest, into New Mexico, into Arizona. Someone was traveling. Someone was confident enough to keep pulling cash from a dead girl's account across state lines, which meant either they did not understand how financial tracking worked, or they thought the distance made them safe. Israel Keyes understood how financial tracking worked better than most. What he miscalculated was that using the card at all, even on the road, even hundreds of miles from Alaska, created exactly the kind of consistent, moving, traceable thread he had spent 11 years making sure never existed. He had always been invisible because he never left anything that moved. This time, he did. The trail ended in Lufkin, Texas. A surveillance camera at an ATM captured a clear image of the man using Samantha Koenig's card. The image went to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation coordinated with Texas Rangers. Within days, they had a name. Within days after that, they had a traffic stop. Keyes was pulled over in Lufkin on March 13, 2012. The stop was controlled. Law enforcement knew who they were looking for, and they approached accordingly. Keyes was calm. He did not run. He did not reach for anything. He asked, in a measured voice, what the problem was. Investigators who were there later described his composure as unsettling, not the calm of someone who had been caught and accepted it, but the calm of someone who was already thinking about what came next. In his vehicle was Samantha Koenig's debit card, a significant amount of cash, and a loaded weapon. He was arrested on the spot and extradited back to Alaska. At that point, the charge was kidnapping and murder in connection with Samantha Koenig. That was the entire case, as far as anyone in law enforcement knew. A man had abducted a teenager from a coffee stand in Anchorage, killed her, staged a ransom, and used her bank card across 6 states before getting pulled over in East Texas. Terrible, specific, contained. Nobody knew about Vermont. Nobody knew about the murder kits. Nobody knew about the 11 trips, the buried caches, the cash-only system, the deliberate geographic fragmentation of a decade's worth of violence. The Anchorage detective who would later lead the interrogations, Monique Doll, said afterward that walking into that room with Israel Keyes, she thought she knew what kind of case she had. She did not. Because Keyes was not just a man who had made a mistake in Anchorage. He was a man who had been operating across the entire country for more than a decade. And the only reason he was sitting in a room with federal investigators instead of flying home from his next trip was that he had broken the one rule that had kept him invisible. He had operated close to home. He had used a card instead of cash. 2 mistakes in 11 years. That was all it took. What came next in that interrogation room would take months, and it still is not finished. Monique Doll had worked homicide in Anchorage for years. She had sat across from murderers before. She knew how those conversations went. The denials, the deflections, the slow collapse toward confession under pressure. She was prepared for that. What she was not prepared for was a man who came into the room already willing to talk, who never needed pressure, and who treated the entire process like a negotiation he intended to win. Keyes had conditions. He would talk, but he would decide what to talk about, in what order, and at what pace. He was not going to be led through a timeline by investigators who thought they already understood the shape of the case. If they wanted what he knew, they would follow him, not the other way around. He started with Vermont. The name alone stopped the room. Anchorage investigators had no open case in Vermont, no connection, no file, no reason to have ever looked at Essex. Keyes described the Currier murders with the same flat, precise language he used for everything else. The flight into Chicago, the rental car, the drive east, the kit he had buried 2 years before he ever met Bill and Lorraine Currier, the disabled alarm, the blitz, the abandoned farmhouse. He walked investigators through each step methodically, the way a contractor would walk a client through a project scope. Here is what I did. Here is why I did it that way. Here is how I made sure it could not be traced. He was not confessing in the way people confess. He was not unburdening himself. There was no visible relief, no emotion breaking through, no sense that telling the truth was costing him anything. He was explaining his work, and the work was something he was, by every indication, deeply proud of. The murder kits came next. He described the concept, the contents, the burial locations, some of them, not all. He was strategic about what he confirmed and what he left open. Investigators later said it felt deliberate, like he was giving them enough to establish credibility while keeping certain details back as leverage. He understood that information was the only currency he had left, and he was not going to spend it all at once. He told them he had killed at least 11 people, possibly more. He hinted at crimes in the Pacific Northwest, in the Midwest, in multiple states he had moved through on those 11 trips between 2001 and 2012. He could not always give names, because he did not know the names. He had not known the names of most of his victims before he chose them. That was the point. Random selection, no connection, no trail. What he wanted in exchange was specific. He had a daughter. He did not want her name in the media. He did not want her to grow up reading about what her father had done in detail that she could not process. That was the ask. Keep her out of it, and he would keep talking. Federal Bureau of Investigation agents took the deal seriously because the alternative was losing access to the only person on Earth who could map what had actually happened across a decade of undetected violence. The Federal Bureau of Investigation agents who conducted those interviews gave accounts afterward that were remarkably consistent in one detail. They described the experience as unlike anything in their careers. Not because Keyes was frightening in the way violent offenders often are in custody, but because he was teaching them. He was walking them through a system they had not known existed, explaining its logic, correcting their assumptions, filling in gaps, not to help them, but because talking about it was the last form of control available to him. He never showed guilt. That has been said about a lot of killers, and it is often overstated. With Keyes, it was not overstated. Anchorage detective Monique Doll said it plainly in the aftermath. He did not kill because he was broken, or sick, or out of control. He killed because he genuinely enjoyed it. And the enjoyment was not just in the act, it was in the planning, the systems, the architecture of a life designed to make the worst things he did completely invisible. He showed methodology. And then, just as the interviews were deepening into territory that might have answered the hardest questions, Keyes decided he was done letting anyone else control the ending. 11. That is the number the Federal Bureau of Investigation settled on publicly, after months of interviews and cross-referencing travel records against construction contracts, against bank withdrawals, against rental car logs. 11 victims. And investigators were careful, when they announced that number, to frame it correctly. 11 was not a conclusion. It was a flaw. Keyes himself made that clear, not in a single statement, not in one clean admission, but across the long arc of those interrogation sessions, in the way he would hint at a crime and then pull back, in the way he would reference a location he had been to without specifying what that meant, in the way he would occasionally smile at a question investigators thought was simple. He knew things he was not telling them. He knew things he enjoyed not telling them. The gap between what he confirmed and what he suggested was wide enough to hold an unknown number of lives. The Federal Bureau of Investigation tried to map the gaps. They pulled his flight records for the full span of his adult life. They cross-referenced dates with his construction schedule, which jobs were running, which ones had pauses, which contracts showed a week of inactivity that did not match weather delays or material shortages. They looked at bank withdrawals in Alaska, large cash pulls that preceded trips where no financial trace followed. They requested rental car records from every major agency at every airport he was known to have used. They were trying to build a geography of absence, a map of the places where Israel Keyes had been that nobody could account for. What they found was that the gaps were real and they were significant. There were trips where the destination was never confirmed. There were windows of time, sometimes a week, sometimes longer, where Keyes dropped off every trackable system, and the only thing investigators knew for certain was that he was not in Alaska. What he was doing, and where, during those windows, is still officially unknown. Some researchers and law enforcement analysts who studied the case afterward identified cold cases in multiple states that share characteristics with Keyes's known crimes. Rural properties, victims without obvious enemies, no forced entry or entry methods that suggested planning, disappearances rather than discovered crime scenes. Those cases have been re-examined. None have been conclusively linked to Keyes, partly because the evidentiary bar for that connection is high, and partly because the one person who could confirm or deny it chose to die before anyone could ask him directly. The murder kits that were never recovered represent the deepest layer of that uncertainty. Keyes confirmed the existence of multiple buried caches. Some were found. Some were moved by Keyes himself, and then reburied in locations he described only partially during the interrogations. At least, some of those kits are still in the ground, somewhere in this country. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's best assessment is that not every kit was used, but they cannot rule out that some were. The distinction matters enormously to families in cold case files across the Pacific Northwest, the Midwest, and New England who have been waiting years for an explanation that never came. What makes this layer of the case particularly hard to sit with is the design. The gaps are not accidental. Keyes built a system specifically so that if he was ever caught, investigators would find themselves standing at the edge of what they could prove, looking out at a much larger territory they could not. He did not just commit crimes without getting caught. He committed crimes in a way that made the full scope of them almost impossible to reconstruct. Even from inside a federal interrogation room, even with months of cooperation, even with maps spread across the table and agents who had made this case their entire professional focus, the truth kept receding, and then he made sure it would stay that way. Early on the morning of December 2nd, 2012, a corrections officer at the Anchorage Correctional Complex made his rounds and found Israel Keyes dead in his cell. He had cut his wrists and used a bedsheet to strangle himself. The official ruling was suicide. He was 34 years old. Under his body, investigators found a handwritten document, several pages, written partly in his own blood. It was not a confession. It was not an apology. It was not a list of names or locations or any of the things the Federal Bureau of Investigation had spent months trying to extract from him. It was a poem, dark, dense, circling around themes of power and dominance, and the idea that death, chosen on his own terms, was the final proof of control. Investigators who read it described it as unsettling, not because it was violent, but because it was coherent. It was the work of someone who had thought carefully about what he wanted to leave behind and had chosen this. That is the detail that matters most about how Israel Keyes died. He did not break under pressure. He did not unravel. He was not cornered into a desperate act by the weight of what was coming. He had been sitting in that cell for 9 months, talking to federal agents on his own schedule, giving them pieces of the picture while keeping others back, and at some point, he decided the interviews had run their course. He had said what he wanted to say. He had protected his daughter's identity as best he could. He had demonstrated, at length, that he was the most organized and disciplined violent offender the Federal Bureau of Investigation had encountered in a domestic case in recent memory. And then he ended it. His death cut off the pipeline instantly. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had been in the middle of active, ongoing sessions. There were questions on the table, specific questions about specific locations, about trips that could not be accounted for, about buried kits whose coordinates he had been slowly working toward confirming. All of it stopped the moment that corrections officer walked the hallway. There would be no next session. No more maps spread across the interrogation table. No more carefully metered revelations. Agents who worked the case described that moment in terms that went beyond professional frustration. One described it as a second crime, the idea that Keyes had committed violence, not just against his victims, but against the possibility of ever fully knowing what he had done. He took the answers with him, deliberately. The poem under his body was not a farewell. It was a statement. He was telling anyone who read it that this ending, like every other part of his life, was his choice and no one else's. The families of Bill and Lorraine Currier learned about his death and understood immediately what it meant. Without Keyes able to guide investigators to the farmhouse basement in Essex, the search for the remains became something close to impossible. The property had been examined before. Nothing conclusive had been found. Now the one person who knew exactly where the bodies were had made sure he would never have to say. Samantha Koenig's case was formally resolved. Keyes had been indicted on kidnapping and murder charges before his death, and that case closed with him. But closure is a strange word for what the Koenig family had. Their daughter's remains had been recovered from Matanuska Lake, cut from the ice with a chainsaw. They buried her. The Currier family has never had that. What he left behind was not a solved case. It was a case file full of fragments, confirmed crimes, hinted crimes, buried kits in unknown locations, cold cases across 6 or 7 states that may or may not carry his fingerprints. A system designed to outlast the man who built it. And in that, Even in death, Israel Keyes got exactly what he wanted. To understand why Israel Keyes was so difficult to catch, you have to understand how law enforcement actually finds serial offenders, not the television version, the real version. The foundation of it is pattern recognition. Investigators look for clusters. Where did the crimes happen? What do the victims have in common? What does the timing suggest? Is the offender escalating? Are they getting bolder, moving closer to home, leaving more behind? Every behavioral data point gets fed into a model that has been refined over decades of casework. The model works because human behavior, even violent human behavior, follows patterns. People gravitate toward familiar geography. They target types that carry psychological meaning for them. They get comfortable. They get sloppy. The system is built to catch that. Keyes had read the system. Not literally. There is no evidence. He studied Federal Bureau of Investigation behavioral science manuals in a library somewhere. But through observation, through intelligence, through the kind of cold, analytical mind that assessed everything in terms of risk and exposure, he had arrived at a near-complete understanding of how the machinery of detection worked. And then he built himself in the opposite direction. No victim profile. That is not just unusual, it is almost singular in the documented history of serial violent offenders in the United States. Virtually every case study in the literature identifies a type: age, range, gender, appearance, circumstance. Some element that connects the victims to something in the offender's psychology. Keyes told investigators plainly that he chose victims randomly. Men and women, different ages, different settings. The only consistent rule was that he would not target children, and he would not target parents of young children, a boundary he explained in terms of his own daughter, not in terms of morality. He was not making an ethical distinction. He was protecting a feeling. Everything else was open. No geographic anchor. The profiling tools that map offender behavior to a probable home base require crimes to cluster in some relationship to where the person lives and works. Keyes gave them nothing to cluster. 11 trips across a decade, different regions, different states, no revisits, no areas of obvious comfort or familiarity. His home was in Alaska. His crimes were everywhere else. The distance between those two facts was so complete that geographic analysis produced nothing usable. Long cooling off periods. Most behavioral models track escalation, the idea that an offender's activity increases over time as the compulsion grows stronger and the inhibitions wear thinner. Keyes did not escalate in any way investigators could measure. He would go silent for a year, sometimes longer. Then he would take a trip, then go silent again. The behavioral timeline had no rhythm that profiling tools could lock onto. No preparation visible near the crime scene. This is the one that kept coming up in the Federal Bureau of Investigation own internal assessments. In almost every violent offender case, there is a detectable preparation phase. Someone bought supplies nearby. Someone asked questions around town. Someone was seen in the area before the crime. The murder kits eliminated that entirely. By the time Keyes arrived at a location, everything he needed was already in the ground. He showed up, used what was there, and left. No local hardware store run. No strange car parked on the street for 2 days beforehand. No trace of approach. The Federal Bureau of Investigation own conclusion, stated clearly in the aftermath of his death, was that a single mistake caught him, not a technique, not an investigation that worked its way toward him from the outside. Samantha Koenig's debit card moved. That was it. A financial thread in a system he had operated in for a decade without leaving any. That is not a flaw in law enforcement. That is the result of a man who spent years studying detection and engineering his behavior to defeat it at every layer. He was not a killer who got lucky. He was a system that nearly worked completely. As of today, the Federal Bureau of Investigation has not officially closed the Israel Keyes investigation. That detail alone says something. A man who died in custody in 2012, who confessed on record, who was indicted on murder charges before his death, and the investigation is still open. Because the case was never really about what he confessed to. It was always about what he did not. The confirmed victim count stands at 11. Investigators who worked the case closely will tell you that number is a flaw, not a conclusion. The Federal Bureau of Investigation said publicly after his death that they believed his actual toll was higher, possibly significantly higher. They could not prove it. They still cannot, because the only person who knew the full shape of it chose to die before they could finish asking. The locations of several murder kits remain unknown. Keyes confirmed their existence. He described some of their contents. He gave investigators partial coordinates and fragments of geography that pointed towards certain regions without ever landing on a specific spot. Some were found, some were moved. At least some are still out there, buried in ground that nobody has had a reason to dig up, in states where nobody has connected the landscape to a man from Alaska who passed through once and never came back. The Currier family has never been able to bury Bill and Lorraine. That is not a figure of speech. The bodies were never recovered. Essex police searched the abandoned farmhouse. Federal investigators went over the property. Without Keyes walking them to the exact location, the remains of two ordinary people who went to work one day and did not come home have simply not been found. Their family has been living with that absence for more than a decade. Samantha Koenig is the only victim whose case resulted in a formal charge before Keyes died. Her remains were recovered from Matanuska Lake. She was buried. Her family had that, at least, something physical to mark the end of her life. The Currier family did not get that. The families of whoever else Keyes may have killed over 11 trips across a decade never got a knock on the door, never got a name attached to a case file, never got anything at all. Cold cases in multiple states, rural disappearances, isolated properties, victims without obvious enemies, have been re-examined in light of what is known about Keyes's travel patterns. None have been conclusively linked to him. The evidentiary bar is high, and the man who could clear it is gone. What Israel Keyes built was not just a killing operation. It was a system designed to outlast him. The buried kits, the nameless victims, the trips that cannot be fully accounted for, the gaps in the timeline that nobody alive can fill. He understood, probably from early on, that the architecture of what he was doing would survive him, that even if he was caught, even if he talked, there would be a version of it that stayed buried, permanently, by design. He was right.